The Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. John the Baptist saw Jesus coming toward him and declared, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, 'After me comes a man who ranks ahead of me because he was before me.' I myself did not know him, but I came baptizing with water for this reason, that he might be revealed to Israel." And John testified, "I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him. I myself did not know him, but the one who sent me to baptize with water said to me, 'He on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain is the one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit.' And I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God." The next day, John was again standing with two of his disciples, and as he watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. When Jesus turned and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated anointed. He brought Simon to Jesus, who looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You can be seated. Who is Jesus? That was the question recently posed to me by a colleague, and I admit for someone in my line of work who should have a ready-made answer to that question, it took me by surprise, and I began to mentally fumble my way through a host of possible responses, searching for the perfect answer. Who is Jesus? It's also the question our gospel writer puts before us today. But instead of one neat answer, we get several. And in fact, the entire first chapter of John seems to be preoccupied with answering that very question. Jesus is the Word, who was with God and is God. Jesus is the true light that enlightens everyone. And perhaps most shocking and surprising of all, Jesus is not only the eternal Word who is and is with God, but this Word is also human, taking on human flesh to live among us. And it's worth noting, by the way, that all of this talk about Jesus precedes any appearance of Jesus himself. And there's still more. As John the Baptist proclaims, "Here is the Lamb of God." Now, maybe John was thinking of the Passover lamb slaughtered by his ancestors in ancient Egypt and whose blood was painted on their doorposts as a visible sign of protection from the final plague. Or maybe his hearers thought of Isaiah's description of the suffering servants, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, whose life was made an offering for sin. Or maybe a foggy mix of both somewhere within their religious heritage. But in either case, Jesus, the Lamb of God, is understood to be someone who will protect, provide for, and even intervene on behalf of God's people. Then, recalling the earlier episode of Jesus' baptism, John is bold to further assert that the Lamb of God is also the Son of God. John is clear that Jesus has a special relationship with God, and as we already know from verses before, is himself God. And it's these two descriptors of Jesus as the Lamb of God and the Son of God that are enough to prompt two of John's disciples to drop everything and start following Jesus. Certainly sounds intriguing, if nothing else. Rabbi, they call him. They want to learn from Jesus, the teacher, because they recognize that there might be something worth learning from him. Interestingly, in John, it's not Jesus who explicitly calls the first disciples. It's another disciple, Andrew, who invites his brother, Simon Peter. We have found the Messiah, the Anointed One, another answer to this question of Jesus' identity. Is he the heir to King David, who will restore and rescue the kingdom of Israel? There is great hope in Andrew's declaration, and it's enough to pull Simon Peter along for the ride. Who is Jesus? There's really no easy answer to that question in the first chapter of John, and in fact, there are many answers depending on who you ask. Word, light, Lamb of God, Son of God, Rabbi, Messiah. Who is Jesus? Perhaps the most profound answer to that question comes by way of another question from Jesus himself, when he finally gets a chance to speak. What are you looking for? Come and see. Who is Jesus? The answer Jesus gives to that question is not a didactic lecture, but an invitation to action. Who Jesus is lies in what Jesus is calling his disciples to do. You want to know who I am, where I'm staying, and what I'm up to? Come and see. Come and find out. Who is Jesus? There's no easy answer here, but instead an invitation to active participation. We all know the name Martin Luther King Jr., commemorated today on our church calendar as a martyr and renewer of society. Less well known, however, is the name Robert Gretz, pictured here with King. Gretz, who was born in West Virginia in 1928, graduated from what is now Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. In June of 1955, and newly ordained, Reverend Gretz was called to serve as pastor of the majority black Lutheran congregation, Trinity Lutheran Church in Montgomery, Alabama. It was barely 6 months before Rosa Parks would be arrested, sparking what ultimately became the Montgomery bus boycotts. Gretz urged his congregation to fully participate in the boycott, and he himself organized carpools and became a shuttle driver for as many as 50 people a day. Most notably, Reverend Gretz was also the only white clergy person to publicly support the boycott. Despite his efforts, he failed to rally the support of his fellow white ministers, and even the wider white population of Montgomery began to distance themselves from Gretz and from his family. Tensions came to a head the following summer, just over a year into his call at Trinity, when his house was bombed for the first time. Even after the boycott ended, the attacks didn't. A second bomb detonated on their front lawn, with Reverend Gretz, his wife, their children, and even his mother at home. Like King and the other black civil rights leaders of his day, Reverend Gretz faced harassment, death threats, and violent attacks over the course of his ministry. But still, Gretz was white. He could easily have had a comfortable life. He could have chosen, like the rest of his fellow white clergy, to just stay out of it all. He could have turned down the call to Montgomery altogether. Instead, he chose to throw aside that comfort and to risk his own safety and security to do what he knew was right and what had to be done. Gretz took his call as a pastor and as a disciple of Jesus seriously. And he did what the gospel demanded, no matter the cost. As the late theologian James Cone once observed, if you are going to worship somebody that was nailed to a tree, you must know the life of a disciple of that person is not going to be easy. I hardly think Andrew, Simon Peter, and those first disciples to follow Jesus knew exactly what they were in for. Even with John the Baptist's bold testimony, they still had only just met Jesus. They hardly knew who he was, let alone what he was about to do. They certainly could never have predicted it would lead to the cross. You want to know who I am? Come and see. Learning who Jesus is, who Jesus really is, meant having to get up and get out of their familiar comfort zones, going to places unknown and taking risks. As they would soon learn, following Jesus is going to be uncomfortable. And if it feels otherwise, we're doing it wrong. Following Jesus means hearing the word and doing it. Today, as we remember Dr. King and Reverend Gretz and all of the civil rights leaders past and present, it means more than just confessing the sin of racism in the words of our liturgy. It means actually acting on our confession by the way we live and advocating for justice for all people, especially the most vulnerable. Following Jesus sometimes means, as Gretz later reflected, joining the trouble, because it's the right thing to do. Recently, I came across the reverse St. Francis prayer. Lord, make me a channel of disturbance. Where there is apathy, let me provoke. Where there is compliance, let me bring questioning. Where there is silence, may I be a voice. Where there is too much comfort and too little action, grant disruption. Where there are doors closed and hearts locked, grant the willingness to listen. When laws dictate and pain is overlooked, when tradition speaks louder than need, grant that I may seek rather to do justice than to talk about it. Disturb us, O Lord, to be with as well as for the alienated, to love the unlovable as well as the lovely. Lord, make me a channel of disturbance. That is what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to come and see. So who is Jesus? Well, the answer I ultimately arrived at when asked that question by my colleague is that Jesus, for me, is someone who has done the hard things, who has challenged the status quo and made it through to the other side, empowering us to do the same. Because Jesus has been to the places of pain and suffering, we are compelled to go there too. Because Jesus took risks for the sake of the gospel, we can take risks for the sake of our mission too. Because Jesus caused the trouble, we can join the trouble. Because we know that Jesus has been there, wherever there is, and that Jesus is with us still. And because the answer on the other side of come and see is full of promise, liberation, freedom, resurrection, and beloved community. As Jesus himself has promised, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus invites us who are his disciples to come and see, to be active participants in his gospel mission. Jesus doesn't promise it's going to be easy or give us all of the answers. Instead, he invites us into the trouble, and he promises to be right there with us through it all.